Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill. Today I'm joined by Mike Duggan, my business partner at CastleHill and one of the managing directors, and Kevin Sasser from Argos Risk. Kevin, would you be kind enough to maybe give a little bit of background about yourself and a quick introduction?
My name is Kevin Sasser. I'm Director of Sales at Argos Risk. We specialize in risk intelligence for commercial third parties. We, I have the great fortune of working with companies on the cutting edges of compliance and third-party risk management in terms of keeping them up to speed on what's happening from a financial viability as well as business continuity standpoint with their third-party relationships.
Awesome. And so today's conversation, and Mike and Kevin are both our star guests here today, is really going to be talking about that aspect and where the industry is heading. We get a lot of conversations, and I'm sure, Kevin, you talk a lot about it as well, around folks who are concerned about the volume of information that they have to process relative to their third parties, and are also concerned about the fact that it's a tremendous requirement from a resource perspective to actually sift through all that information. And what are people in the industry seeing? What is the direction that we're headed towards?
From my perspective, the industry is taking let's say, call it a tectonic shift away from a reactive mindset to a proactive mindset. Um, you know, for the past, since 2018, we had just finished up a 12-year expansion of our economy, and things were good. So you could kind of halfway guess in a third-party risk assessment, and there probably wasn't going to be any consequences. Well, in 2018, that started a downward trend in the number of suppliers, strains on global supply chains, strains on vendor relationships. And all of a sudden in 2020, companies started getting that unfortunate surprise. Oh, we're going to have to shut down because this third party vendor can't deliver. And every time that little shutdown happened, millions of dollars were lost. So in September, I'll give you an example. In September of 2020, I got a phone call from the procurement manager of a global manufacturing company. And this very sharp professional, but the emotions were just overwhelming, and I was the recipient of them. And he was sharing with me his frustration because they did everything by the book, the policies, everything was squared away, and he still had three vendors fail on him that year. And he was actually holding up a stack of audited financials from a vendor. He's like, "We look at this data." And I was like, "Really? How many people on your team are actually qualified to review financial statements?" And then there was this awkward pause. And then I said, "By the way, what's the date on those financial statements?" Because we were talking in September 2020. He looks and he goes, December of 2019. I was like, and this is where he got mad at me. I'm like, "Did anything happen between December 2019 and then September 2020 that could have impacted the financial viability of this company?" And of course, I was mentioning the pandemic and all that jazz. And then kind of the key point here is companies for the longest time, they were good at getting the data. They weren't great at understanding the data and what it was trying to tell them. And then somewhere along the lines, we got ingrained that an annual review was sufficient for vetting our mission critical vendors. And that doesn't take place at any other point of operations within a typical business, right? And so, like, if you're an ice cream vendor and you got that, and you rely on that ice cream truck to deliver that your goods and your raw materials to you, you're going to check on them more than just in January, right? You're going to make sure that you're going to have that ice cream too. And the industry itself is waking up and says, like, you know what? Everything else in the world moves at lightning speed. We have global supply chains. I can order something from China and have it in my office in Atlanta in about 6 days. That's how quick everything moves. And now our compliance programs have to keep up with that type of environment. So that's the level of automation and just the seriousness that's being paid to this area now has dramatically jumped in the past 24 months. Um, Mike, would you agree with all that, what I just shared?
100%. And I think, what you're also talking to, Kevin, is the volume of information is is over the top. You think about just some of the basic things that are part of a program that you build in, or that if you're regulated, the regulators are expecting you to build in. It continues to grow and grow and grow. The expectation is you're going to get away from being reactive, to your point earlier, and getting to that continuous monitoring state where you're starting to look at trends. You're starting to see things that are happening ahead of it, and not being as reactive, but now getting ahead of it and starting to, at a minimum, make people internally understand something is happening here and we need to pay attention to it. It doesn't mean something horrible is going to happen, but at a minimum, we should be paying attention to it. And there is an expectation in the industry that that is happening. Whether you're a third party provider to somebody else, and you have everybody has customers, those customers are expecting you're doing this as well. Um, Beyond just the internal policy compliance that you're seeing out there, which is very, very important. The fact of the matter is that um, companies are now getting in trouble for these things as well. They're not just losing opportunities and losing business because of failed suppliers, but secondary to that, they're actually getting in trouble because these suppliers aren't doing business in the way that they're supposed to. So there's just so much to take in, and being able to do that efficiently, it's without tools, without folks like Argos Risk that are helping to bring that data together and make it meaningful. There's an awful lot. There's an awful lot that you have to pull together, and that's where I think that the value of service providers come into play, because it, you would have to have an army of people to get through this, to your point, and experts in so many different areas.
A good attitude in an Excel spreadsheet has caused more early retirements in risk compliance than anything else, because there's just, and I'll give you a point of reference. In 2017, going a few years back, a good compliance program, you had a questionnaire, you had their contracts, you had their SOC report, and you might have had an annual copy of their or audited financials, and that was about it. And now here we are in 2022, and take all that and then throw on top of that cyber obligations and then ESG and then maybe PEP scanning. I mean, just the areas of responsibility, it's almost becoming like ragu. It's in there. If there's something involving a third party, they're in some industries, they're expecting this greatly expanded universe that the compliance team or the procurement team is supposed to be mastering. And if you don't have some level of investment in the infrastructure around that, you're going to drown.
100%. And you're starting to see that happen. And the expertise that's required in every one of those areas that you point out is different. Uh, as you mentioned, with the financials, you're evaluating financials. Well, yes, you can look at certain metrics inside of those financials, and those should be the indicators. But are those people truly trained on what those metrics mean, and what a trend in that area means, and is there an offset to that? Those are the things that people they underestimate the effort that goes into that, and that movement happens on a quarterly basis. So now you're evaluating maybe hundreds, some cases thousands of vendors for this information. You need that real time. You need that information to be as quick as possible, so that you're seeing that the tools are available out there to help with the trending analysis and to understand and take that data and turn it into something, into reporting that's meaningful. Um, but you have to start with the data, and just pulling together the data is an enormous exercise. Uh, and where again, you see more and more of this out there, beyond the types of events we're starting to see out there as well. They're impacting vendors, right? Vulnerabilities, CVEs coming out, these vulnerabilities coming out left and right. Every other week, it seems like you've got something coming out, and you're saying, okay, is this impacting us? Is this not impacting us? Is it going to impact our third parties, our fourth parties, and so forth? How do we gather all of that information and do something about it, right? Because management is asking about it. What are we doing? What are we doing to deal with these situations that are popping up? Because what are they doing? They're hearing about it from customers. They're hearing about it from other parts of the organization. What are we doing to deal with this? And the answer is, a lot of cases, well, we're doing the best we can.
We're hanging on. Yeah,
We're just
exactly.
hanging on. What an answer! What a response! And it's reality. And it's not due to the fact that people don't want to do the work. It's just that the task at hand it's a mountain. You're trying to move that mountain.
I think the two pieces you guys have talked about, and you're probably going to go there, Kevin, is that you talked about the common, or the constant hum that has to be there, right? There's always noise that's coming from your vendors and your supply chain, and as some folks I know like to say, hope is not a strategy, right? So what is happening across that entire vendor space for you? But then you also have these dramatic upticks of an individual action, whether it's a cyber related item or a global geopolitical activity like we have today. Any number of events that can actually get there between the pandemic or the war in Ukraine. All those pieces are big dangers that the management teams are now responsible for, especially across the world. You know, how's that playing into this?
So, so a little bit of a side note. I think we can all agree that I look great for my age, but I am old as dirt. And I bring that up is because I was working in the fintech sector in the early '90s when the OFAC list, first came out, and it was on a DOS platform, and you downloaded it from the government's BBS site, and you checked your wire transfers against it, and that was the OFAC compliance thing. And I've known banking professionals for 30 years who, in day-to-day practice, have never encountered an OFAC company on the sanctions list. There's some that do, but there's a lot of community bankers who never had the experience. All that's thrown out the window. In the past, since Russia invaded Ukraine, I mean, how many times have you heard the word sanctions in the news? Well, a lot. And every time that happens, a new company goes on the SDN list, and then all of a sudden, organizations that would never have even crossed your mind to do a compliance check are on the OFAC list. And I'll give you a point. There's an aluminum plant in, I call it Nowhereville, Kentucky, in a remote part of Kentucky that, vanilla as the day is long. But oh, by the way, they're the group that owns them has a Russian oligarch on the board, and now they're working their way onto the SDN list. So the whole OFAC sanctions listing or sanctions checking exercise has gone from almost boring snoozeville to like, oh my gosh, we just realized that this third party or this fourth party now, it could put us in danger of violating international sanctions.
Not a pleasant time for that.
No.
And it's usually those companies you would have had no idea, to your point, Kevin, when you're talking about this aluminum company. Nobody would have any idea. It wouldn't even cross a supply chain manager's mind that this vendor who you've been doing business with, a supplier for years, could potentially become a problem for you. You would have no idea. And now suddenly you're in a situation where you're saying you may be scrambling, saying, I either need to find a way to do business with them, or if I can't do business with them, what am I going to do? And where does it go from there? And it does take a little bit of time for the to make its way through the SDN, as you mentioned. But when it happens, everybody that's using that vendor is in the same exact boat. So they're all out searching for a replacement vendor for that to try and get those same products. It can pretty much count on prices going up and everything else associated with that, because you've just potentially taken a vendor off of the approved vendor list. For a lot of companies, there's a big downstream impact of that. So knowing ahead of time and understanding what that looks like is going to be very, very valuable.
One of the practices we've seen along those lines is we've noticed that more and more, especially in manufacturers, are keeping those backup vendors in their compliance universe ahead of the game. So maybe it's not somebody we're doing business right now, but it's somebody that they're if vendor A goes out, we're going to go to vendor B. So let's go ahead and monitor vendor B now. And so that because the worst case scenario is vendor A and then vendor B goes out, and then you're really stuck.
That's a perfect storm. That's a bad situation to be in. Um, that's when supply chain managers lose jobs, right? Things go horribly wrong. The idea here is to stay ahead of it as much as possible. Uh, we brought up the Russia Ukraine situation. The changes that have come with that, there wasn't a single compliance department that we work with that was fully prepared to handle that. It was even though they could see this buildup happening over the course of months, it was kind of heads down, where business as usual, and then all of a sudden everybody's kind of hoping, you're almost fingers crossed that this thing kind of de-escalates and it doesn't become a problem, and then it becomes a problem. And how do you adjust to that And what we saw a lot of was executive committees being formed to then analyze the impact of this thing that happened that frankly they probably should have been ahead of, but knowing the way that businesses operate, again, the hope is for de-escalation, but it didn't happen. So how do you react to that? And I got many phone calls saying, uh, can you get, how do we get data? How do we get information? I'm getting all these questions. I'm getting hit left and right. What is the impact to us? Do we really understand what that looks like? And in the only way that you could get there was through some of these, through data sources, through service providers. And I said, there is a cost to that, but it is very valuable.
You've probably seen this as well as I have. If you talk to an organization that is understaffed, underfunded, under-resourced, but overworked in a particular area, the likelihood of them having confirmation bias of seeing what they want to see in the environment jumps dramatically versus someone who has a process in place. It's like, oh, we have a geopolitical situation unfolding that can impact our supply chain. Let's be proactive about it. The overworked the overworked team is going to be like, oh yeah, well we use that company and they're great and they tell us everything's fine, so we're just going to we're just going to ignore it and just hope for the best. So yeah, that the level of resources you've invested within an organization does influence that mental mindset of, are we going to be proactive, reactive? Are we going to see what we want to see? Or are we going to see the groundwork as it is through a unbiased perspective?
Sort of in that vein, I think um, how important is it for a company to actually understand what their vendor supply chain looks like? Right, that's one of the things that in that same overworked scenario, right? They're ignoring the fact that, in the example you gave of the aluminum manufacturer, right? It's almost guaranteed that the five next aluminum manufacturers on that list also are owned by some consortium that has a challenge associated with it, and so it's hard enough to just deal with the vendors. How about the vendors that just might be those out there? Are we seeing anything from that perspective of companies really looking across the entire vendor population and asking those questions?
Oh, I have a very robust response to that. Again, back to my aged wisdom. When we first started hearing the word supply chain, and when Toyota kind of pioneered efficient supply chain management back in the 60s and 70s, it was all about getting the product as quickly to my company as fast as possible. That was it. And so we built these very efficient but very fragile supply chains. And now, fast forward to today, and now we got to worry about product quality, product delivery. But now I got to worry about business continuity issues. Resiliency is like, okay, how robust is this vendor? Am I going to be weathering this next storm? And then that's kind of transition into reputational management. You inherit the reputation of the companies you do business with. So do you want to be, when someone Googles a company's name, do you want your name to pop up with them? And that's becoming a big thing. And along those lines, and this could be a whole other podcast, is the rise of ESG data, or ESG, environmental, social, and governance data. And this is the next evolution of CSR, corporate social responsibility. So basically, we all want to be better people. And we all, if you're running a company, you want your company to be a better company. And so you want to treat human beings with the respect they deserve. You want to treat the environment the same way and all that jazz. And then in 2020, just some background, the CEO of BlackRock said, you know what, Wall Street, if you're concerned about the environment, put your money where your mouth is. And much to everybody's surprise, they did. So now companies that have structured social responsibility policies in place and practices in place now have practices where they're being scored out and says, this is our score for treating the environment. This is our score for avoiding sweatshops. This is our score for community reinvestment. And Wall Street's taken notice. Others have taken notice. The entire world has taken notice in a very short period of time.
We're seeing a lot of activity around ESG. And I think one of the challenges that people run into is they're not quite sure what to do with it yet, right? There are some companies that are so far ahead of the curve. They've done a great job. They have these CSR programs in place. They've been working with them for years. They've invested in them, but now that it's becoming more, it's certainly becoming part of that uh, corporate reputation, as you point out. uh, you're seeing more and more activity. And as we start talking to more and more companies about ESG and what does it mean for them, they're still trying to figure out what that is. And they're not quite at the point where they're starting to see lots of investment internally, where anybody's willing to put a big budget behind it and say we need to go after this. So instead, they're in this exploratory mode, and they're saying, well, how do I at least stick my toe in the water, at least start getting some information and starting to understand not just what we're doing as a company, but what our entire supply chain is doing that rolls up to the overall impact of how we do business. And there's a lot of challenges associated with that because the information isn't just readily available out there. And it isn't enough to come forward with um, sort of ethereal thoughts around it and bringing that to a board or to a committee. You have to have something meaningful to bring forward. And that usually comes in the form of data. And they say, where do we get this data from? It isn't enough just to read somebody's study. We need to know, how does it impact us? And that's a big challenge for organizations, and we're seeing more and more of that as these committees are forming and people becoming more informed about what it is that they're going to be responsible for if they aren't already. They're scrambling a little bit, saying, I don't know where to begin. So how do we get some help with that? And at least get started down a path, right? Don't don't ignore it. Get started down a path, and we're seeing more and more in that space as well. It's valuable information and valuable services that are being provided that are helping them, these people, and a lot of the times it's not their full time job.
Right.
They're part of some committee. They were kind of, hey, you're part of a business unit, and you're going to be the face of that business unit, for in this space. And they're saying, but I don't know enough about it. And they're saying, well, you're going to learn, and you're going to have to start analyzing some of this and starting to be able to present to it. Uh, Tim, I don't know. I know you can probably elaborate on this a lot better because you're working with some of our other partners that are getting very heavy into this space.
No, I'm the MC. I don't get to talk on these. I mean, well, there's a couple different pieces there because I can't resist talking about it. The and the environmental aspect of it. A lot of people are looking towards the carbon footprint, right, and trying to actually standardize around carbon footprint. And there's a lot of standards that are happening in that space. When you get into the social piece of it, um, then you get a little bit more interesting, and you're looking for reputational risk, right? As we talked about, and so adverse media, and all of that kind of information scraping and going from that perspective.
Yeah, that's you know, luckily we have automation and tools in place on our data platform. So if I pity anybody who's trying to keep up with this manually, because we have over let me give you a point of reference on any particular company that's monitored in our system. We may check a couple hundred to a couple thousand data points every single day, and then distill that down. So to replicate that manually is impossible. But from an adverse media standpoint, you know, let me just share you a trade secret. It's easy to find adverse media. Google away and you'll find it. The challenge is filtering out the noise. Because there's one company in particular that I like to talk about that the first page of their Google results, you can tell a marketing company has manipulated the results because they're all positive fluff pieces. But on the third page is where they're under investigation for financing a genocide in the Sudan, right? So filtering out the noise and finding the real stuff is the challenge, and that's one of the things that our data scientists work on religiously, is making sure that we're capturing the meaningful nuggets and keeping the noise out of our customers' universe. Because at the end of the day, you got to have enough bandwidth to take the meaningful information, process, and then have the confidence to take action on it. And that applies to everything we've touched on right now. It's financial health, it's the cyber, ESG. It's one thing to get the data, but all this is meaningless if you don't have the confidence to say, I understand what the data is trying to tell me, and this is what we're going to do next.
The governance piece of it also then bleeds into it, right? As you talked about, how is the company reacting to those adverse media items? You can't sweep it under the rug, right? So you need to actually be able to understand it. And so That's the big piece that's happening in the ESG side, as you pointed out, Mike. Right, people are trying to figure out how they can dip their toe into it without getting completely swamped from that perspective. Now, I think that the combination of, you have the financial information, we have corporate governance type of activities, you had adverse media, you have the cybersecurity side of it, all of those different pieces where bringing that information together into a holistic picture of how that company is actually operating is one of the emerging challenges, I think, for the entire industry. Is that fair?
Yeah, and to that point, we do a lot of work in the financial services industry, and I'm starting now to see compliance and security experts being brought into board of directors level. So where in years past, where that was kind of like that's an operational thing, blah 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 blah, and now in certain financial institutions, they like have a cybersecurity board member or they have a compliance level board member who's overseeing the efforts from a strategic level to make sure all those programs are funded. A few years ago, I just read a study on this. A few years ago, yeah, I'm going to pick on banking for just a second. Bankers used to love putting contracts with their third parties. It's like we reserve the right to audit you if we find something suspicious, which is great boilerplate. Problem is they never budgeted any money to actually travel to do the audit if that need ever arose. And now we're starting to see budgets and resources and everything slowly increase in industries across the board where they're actually putting the effort behind it to say, my gosh, this is mission critical. This should be one of our strategic tenets, and this is how we're going to thrive moving forward.
How do you tier that risk though, Mike? And Mike, maybe some of that stuff, right? How do you determine these are the top 10, but I can't ignore the bottom 1,000, right?
Well, one of the things that comes out of this, and I preach this a lot to our clients, is prioritization. It's one of the most important things that you can do as part of in this vendor management space, is you have to prioritize that workload. And so you look for data points that you can point to that would allow you to prioritize those that should bubble up to the top and that you should spend your time and energy on. Is it foolproof? No. But when you're already limited in capacity as to what you can do in a year, you have to use something, some quantitative method of getting there. Uh, in the past, it was just qualitative. We think that these vendors are the ones that should be in scope, and that's what we'll go after first. Uh, that left a whole slew of vendors that were untouched, that were probably the bigger problem for you, but you never knew. You had nothing to go off of. You had no basis for it. You could have assessments and you could do reassessments of those vendors, um, but between those reassessment periods, you should be doing something. And more we're starting to see that in the space where there is a requirement. It's not even an option anymore, or a level of maturity that you hope to get to. And people are now being told you just have to get there. It's not an option anymore. To get to a base level of maturity, you have to have these things in place. So what used to be optional is no longer optional. And the boards are hearing this. The executive committees are hearing this. Um, Internal auditors, external auditors are saying it, and everybody having to kind of fall in line and saying we must invest in this. So this is more and more we're starting to see this happen um, as we start to come into what everybody's predicting to be a recessionary period. If there's ever a time that we need to be paying attention closely to what's going on at companies, whether it be adverse media, financial viability, any of those things, compliance, it's now is the time. We have to pay very, very close attention or else get caught. And I understand why regulators, auditors are saying this must become part of your program, whether you like it or not. It's just directionally, it's the way that things have to go. Um, and during a recessionary period, the last thing that anybody wants to hear is, "I need a much bigger budget than I have to go do all of this work." Not an easy. How do I go forward with that? Right? I have this mandate to go do this, but we're coming into a recessionary period. We're having layoffs, things like that are happening. How do I go back and say, you need to give me more money so I can go do this? So you have to find better ways of doing it. You have to find, more efficient ways of doing it so that you have an effective program, but it is very efficient in how you're managing it.
Kevin, maybe we can close out with that sort of an idea of, you know, how does Argos Risk help with that bottom 1,000, right? We know we're the top 10 where it's going to get a lot of attention and all those things, but it's the bottom 1,000 that are going to, or the bottom 500 are the ones that are going to really get you, cause some sort of a problem. So how does Argos Risk help with that?
Well, we provide the. I like to brag that we provide the right amount of data to the right person at the right time. And in the context of a vendor portfolio, let's say, we have tools and services that fit the action. So to give you a reference, one of our clients had 30,000 vendors, and they're like, "Where in the heck do I start? What part of this swimming pool do I start swimming in?" Right? And so, we did an analysis of their entire 30,000 and basically said, okay, of the 30,000, here's your bell curve. Here's the 20% that are high risk. Here's the 80% that are moderate, and here's the 20% that are low risk. So then they were able to go to the high risk vendors and look at and say, okay, what's the relationship? And that's the key to find. What's the relationship with this vendor? Do they have access to customer data? Are they mission critical? Is there a high dollar spend? If so, let's go ahead and do the full blown monitoring and treat them with the respect they deserve. These 20% that are low risk, maybe we just check on them once a year, once a quarter, or depending on what the relationship, and then the others in the middle will make judgment calls. Having it, and without going into too much detail, just having the ability like that has helped our clients dramatically, because instead of feeling overwhelmed and just you know being blind and being reactive to everything, we were able to provide them assistance in developing a strategy. Let's go after these vendors first. Let's get complete visibility and transparency to these. Let's position them properly within our compliance program. And now we have a structure in place that we can then take anything, let's say in the moderate risk area, and either transition them over into the more intense side, or we can shift them into the less intense side because of the nature of the relationship. So that's how we try to help configure our solutions to fit the needs of our clients. So to give you a point of reference, our clients range in scope from Fortune 100 companies to there's this tiny little credit union in Illinois that has one branch, and they use us to monitor 50 of their customers, and they're perfectly happy in their budget, and we do not break their budget whatsoever.
Really enjoy the conversation and love having Argos as a partner. Bringing them into our GRC capabilities. Our GRC as a service is already starting to reap some benefits with our customers, and I'm just looking forward to that continuing as we go on.
Same here.
But thank you both. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill. For more episodes, insights, and discussion, check us out on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, or at our website, www.castlehillrisk.com. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll see you next time on a Coffee Chat with CastleHill.